They say her cries still echo from the stone bell tower when the wind is right, not loud, but long enough to turn a priest's blood cold. The village of Black Hollow lay cradled in a crooked dip of Yorkshire hills, its thatched roofs sagging under centuries of mist and superstition. The Black Death had passed 2 winters ago, leaving behind empty beds and rotting fields. Those who remained walked softly, spoke less, and crossed themselves even at the sound of an owl. At the edge of the village stood the church of St. Adalbert, its bell tower looming like a clenched fist toward heaven, though the bell within had not rung in living memory. Eleanor lived in the last cottage on the western slope, where the trees leaned low and the moss grew thick enough to silence footsteps. She was 17, with lashes dark as soot and a voice that carried like birdsong through the hedges. Her mother, Margaret, was the village midwife, a woman weathered by loss and bound by secrets. Eleanor's father had been taken by the pestilence when she was barely 12. Since then, she and her mother had stitched together a quiet life, serving births in the night and binding wounds with rosemary and boiled nettles. It was at the spring festival that Eleanor first met William, tall, sun-touched, with hands calloused from tending the stables of Lord Heywood's estate. He danced with her near the bonfire, lifting her by the waist as the villagers clapped and drank. Their laughter came easy then, before the world darkened again. He smelled of hay and smoke, and something boyish and wild. They met in the meadows when they could, beneath branches heavy with blossom. And though they never spoke the words aloud, it was understood. After the harvest, they'd marry. But harvest never came. One morning, William was summoned to the monastery. A minor job, they said. 3 days, maybe 4. He kissed her hand beneath the linden tree and promised to bring her back something strange from the abbot's cellar. She waited. For days passed. Then 7. By the 2nd week, her mother stopped asking. In the evenings, Eleanor wandered down the dirt path they'd once shared, whispering his name like a prayer into the fog. By the time the first snow arrived, she knew. Her belly had already begun to change. Small at first, an ache, a tightness, a quickening under her ribs. She told no one. Not yet. She tied her apron tighter and prayed to a God who had gone silent long ago. But villages, like old trees, have eyes. By midwinter, whispers turned to pointed glances. Margaret pleaded with her to flee. Go to her cousin in Kent, find refuge in a distant abbey. But Eleanor stayed. She believed he might still return, that some cruel hand might unwrite the silence he'd left behind. When she stood before the priest, the room went still. Father Matthias was a gaunt man with hands like splinters and eyes that never blinked long. The abbot sat beside him, his silence louder than the bell that never rang. You have sinned, the priest said, voice cold as iron. The child within you is a stain. There will be no christening, no marriage. I love him, she whispered. Do not speak of love. What you carry is not love, but shame. Margaret wept quietly beside her, but did not speak. She knew the laws. A woman with child and no husband was cursed. The devil used such wombs as gateways. The purification was arranged in secret. They came for her in the night, hooded, wordless. One knocked gently on the door, while the others waited outside with a cart. Margaret begged them, offered herbs, coin, even herself. They said nothing. Eleanor's wrists were bound with rough cloth, and a blindfold was pulled over her eyes. The cart creaked through the frozen woods for hours, wheels grinding over brittle leaves. The wind howled through the trees, like distant screams. When they reached the old monastery grounds, she was led by the hand, stumbling over cracked stones and uneven steps. The bell tower. No one had been inside it for years. The upper door had rotted off, and ivy had consumed the outer wall. Inside, it smelled of mold and old metal. The bell loomed above, a great black shape, suspended by rusted chains. They unbound her hands, but left the blindfold on. When it was finally removed, the monks were gone. The door bolted from the outside. She screamed, kicked, pounded her fists raw against the ancient oak. No one came. Days passed, or maybe weeks. Time bled in the dark. Rain came through cracks in the roof, soaking the straw they'd left for her to sleep on. A single wooden bowl was pushed through a slot near the floor. Gruel. Water. sometimes bread. She sang to herself in the dark, soft lullabies her mother used to hum when fever took hold. She traced the cold stone walls, looking for some exit, some weakness. Her belly swelled. The baby grew restless inside her, tumbling in the dark. One night, a storm screamed across the moors. Wind slammed into the tower, thunder shaking the rafters. She curled beneath the bell, her arms wrapped around her stomach, whispering his name over and over. Then the pain came. There was no midwife, no hot water, no hand to hold, just blood, stone, and her voice, hoarse from prayer. The baby arrived in silence. No cry, no breath, only her breath, ragged, cracked, hollow. She held it close, a girl, tiny, perfect, still, wrapped her in what little cloth she had, pressed her lips to its forehead until her tears ran dry. When they came for her, days later, she did not look up. Her hair was matted with blood and straw. The monks said nothing as they dug the hole beneath the bell. They buried the child with no rite, no name. And Eleanor? They locked her back inside. Perhaps they meant to let her die. Perhaps they believed it was mercy. But she did not scream again. She sat, hands folded, back straight, humming lullabies into the stone until her voice faded into silence. Years passed. Moss claimed the tower. Ivy strangled the walls. The bell rotted in place, forgotten. No one spoke of the girl, the child, or what the monks had done. A new priest came. The monastery crumbled. But sometimes, when the wind shifts just right across the moor, old villagers say you can hear it, a voice inside the stone. The bell never rang again, not for her, nor the tiny body buried beneath it. The train hissed as it slowed into the North Yorkshire countryside, cutting through morning mist like a blade through parchment. Rachel Whitmore leaned against the window pane, its chill biting into her skin, and stared out at the rolling fields and ruins that dotted the land like scattered memories. She had crossed the Atlantic not for comfort or leisure, but for silence. The kind of silence that echoes through archives and forgotten stone, whispering truths no one wants to hear. She arrived at the church of St. Adalbert on a dull, slate-gray morning, boots crunching on frostbitten gravel as she approached the ancient rectory. A historian by trade, Rachel had spent the last decade researching the treatment of women during the Middle Ages, the punishments, the disappearances, the unbearable silences in the records. Her British colleagues had warned her. Not all archives wanted to be read, but she had been granted rare access here, deep within the restricted vaults of a centuries-old diocese. In the back room of the rectory, beneath creaking beams and the smell of old parchment and mildew, she found it. A thick ledger, bound in leather so dry it flaked at her touch. A wax seal, still unbroken after God only knew how many lifetimes, read Nulla Lux Intrabit. Let no light enter. She hesitated before pressing the edge of her penknife through the seal. It snapped with a sound that felt too loud for the room. The pages within were handwritten, ink faded to the color of dried blood, Latin scrawled by trembling hands. They weren't records. They were confessions. Rachel translated by the flickering light of a desk lamp. Asterisk, we took the girl to the tower. Her screams did not cease for 3 days. The child was silent when it came. Forgive us. Asterisk, another entry, weeks later. Asterisk, the bell above them has not rung since. We have buried their names with mortar and prayer. Asterisk. She felt her skin prickle. They had hidden something. Not just pain, but a person. A life. 2 lives. The bell tower still stood, skeletal and lichen-covered, part of a crumbling estate just beyond the village's edge. Rachel walked there in the late afternoon, the air damp and heavy. The structure loomed over wild grasses and broken gravestones, its frame sagging but proud, defiant against time. Oddly, there were no stairs, no path to ascend, only sealed stone, mortar-filled gaps where an entry had once been. As she circled the base, an old man tending the grounds watched her from beneath the low cap. They sealed the top, he said without prompting, voice hoarse, after the last scream was heard. He wouldn't say more. Rachel climbed over a fallen beam and entered the shell of the tower. Inside, the air was cold and still. Moss curled along the edges of a stone, and fragments of wooden scaffolding lay collapsed beneath the dormant bell. As she knelt near the center, her hand brushed something that did not belong, a slight rise in the stone, softer earth. She dug carefully, with hands, and then a small trowel from her satchel. Not deep, just enough. 2 small bundles. Bones. One no longer than her forearm, wrapped in what remained of faded linen. She did not cry. She only pressed her hands to her chest and sat in the cold silence for a long time, listening to the stone. There were no grave markers, no records, no carving of a name, no sacred rite, just dust and time, and a bell that hadn't rung in nearly 700 years. In her notes, Rachel began piecing together the girl's life. Based on the monk's confessions, the child was conceived under scandalous circumstances. A young girl, perhaps seduced, perhaps worse, pregnant and unwed in an age that treated such women as cursed. And if her lover had been of the cloth, that alone could explain why her punishment had been so final, so hidden. In the 14th century, it was not uncommon for unmarried pregnant women to disappear. Records were seldom kept. Those caught between church law and male desire suffered behind monastery walls. Some were purified through cold baptisms. Others were confined. A few were buried alive. The church called them sinners. The records called them nothing at all. Eleanor, Rachel whispered to herself. The name surfaced without effort, unspoken yet certain. Eleanor. No one in the modern church admitted to the ledger. Some even doubted its authenticity. The documents disappeared from the archive 2 days after Rachel scanned them, but she kept the copies. And one foggy morning, she returned to the bell tower, a small bouquet of heather in hand. She laid it gently where the bones had rested and whispered words that no one had ever spoken over that grave. I remember you. As she turned to leave, the wind picked up, swirling through the cracks in the stone. The old wooden door, long unhinged, creaked open with a groan like breath returning to lungs. And from deep within the ruined tower, something stirred. Not quite wind, almost a lullaby. Rachel stopped. Her pulse quickened. The air stilled once more, but something had changed, not in the stone, but in her. Somewhere far above, the bell remained silent, and not a single page in the kingdom's history dared to mention her name again.